Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. You're tuning into a 2021 Sundance Film Festival Beyond Film panel brought to you by the Roxie Theater in collaboration with Cinema Tropical. My name is Isabel Fondevila, and I'm the Director of Programming at the Roxie here in San Francisco. The Roxie is one of the satellite screens in this year's festival, and we're delighted to present 12 feature films with our partner venue and driving for Mason Flicks, which overlooks the San Francisco Bay. One of those 12 films is Son of Monarchs, the Alfred P. Sloan Feature Film Prize winner, and a film by Alexis Gambis. In just a moment, you will see and hear Alexis talk about immigration, science, cinema, and butterflies with the founder and executive director of Cinema Tropical, Carlos Gutiérrez. Carlos is a personal hero of mine and a superstar in exhibition and promotion of Latin American film in the United States. So I'm gonna leave you in good company for the next 45 minutes. Thank you so much, Carlos and Alexis, for being here today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy it and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you for that daring introduction. It's a treat to be here with you and with Alexis to talk about his film, but also about his work in general. It's a really a big treat. Let me introduce our very special guest. He's a French Venezuelan filmmaker and biologist, a very common combination, and he's made a professional career combining both elements. He did his undergraduate program in biology at Bard College with a minor in cinema. So from an early age, he was already combining both elements. He also received a Master of Fine Arts in film from Tisch in New York University, from the Tisch School of Arts, and also has a PhD in molecular biology from the Rockefeller University, also here in New York. In 2008, he founded the Imagine Science Film Festival that for many years has been showcasing science in film from around the world. And in 2016, he launched the VOD platform Labocine, which is also known as the Netflix for science, and that fosters a dialogue between scientists, artists, and educators. And in 2014, he directed his feature film, the fiction film The Fly Room, which was based on the true story of the birth of modern genetics at the turn of the 20th century. His latest feature, Son of Monarchs, which, as Isabel said, it's premiering in the next competition at the Sundance Film Festival and was announced as the Alfred P. Sloan Prize Award winner. Tells the story of Mendel, a Mexican biologist played by the wonderful Mexican actor Tenoch Huerta, who studies the Monarch Butterflies and goes back to his hometown in Michoacan after the death of his grandmother, and this trip unleashes a profound transformation in him. He has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, Vice, Nature's, Science, and he's also worked in media installations that have been presented in numerous museums and galleries. And on top of that, he's also assistant professor in the Science and Arts and Humanities Department at New York University in Abu Dhabi, among many other things. A very, very rich resume. Alexis, welcome and congratulations on the premiere and the award of on the Alfred P. Sloan Award at Sundance.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for having me. I just want to also thank Isabel for having me at the Roxie Theater and of course the Fort Mason event that's going to be happening. I wish I could also see the movie overlooking the Bay Area. Would be just a wonderful thing to do right now after all of these months in pandemic. But I also want to thank you, Carlos, for hosting this and of course Cinema Tropical for all of the work that you're doing and supporting Latin American cinema in the US and also supporting these types of films that are unusual, because they're bilingual and they're happening in both Latin America and the US. So thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Right, the treat is mine. And you're already touching some, I think an important thing that's going to come up, popping in our conversation, hybridity, being in between different elements, science, film, cultures, different types of narratives. I want to start just kind of a general background now. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal interest in science and film? I was saying that even from your undergraduate program, you already had those two interests up there. So can you just tell us a little bit about that, how you got connected with both worlds?
Yeah, it's always interesting to to look back at why you made the decisions that you made, because oftentimes you have to speak about, how did I go from science to film, or how do I combine both of these? For me, it was very natural from an early age, because I grew up with, both of my parents are artists. My dad's a painter and worked from home my whole life. I lived between New York and Paris, and my mom was a filmmaker going to NYU Film School when I was a kid, and when we were living in Brooklyn, and so I grew up with artists in the house. So for me, the process of making art and also witnessing making films was very much part of my life. And I would sit on the stoop of my house and speak to these like drug addicts that were also actors on the stoop of my apartment of the house that I lived in Brooklyn. But then, yeah, so later on, when I ended up finishing high school and I went to Bard, I realized that I was very interested in biology, and I was very interested in the aesthetics, how things worked, but from a very kind of visual appeal. I was interested in genetics, what it meant for genes to control different traits and how we look like. And I remember also like scribbling DNA helix on my wall. I was just very interested in the world, also the microscopic world. And I have no skills in drawing or painting like my father, but that's sort of how it started. And then at Bard, as you were mentioning, I went to Bard for undergrad, and it was a very small liberal arts school. At the time, the science department was very small. Now it's expanded, but so the biology department was just a group of people that were also taking, studio arts and drawing and film classes, and then we would end up in these classes in genetics. And so I already, I wasn't combining both, but I already was seeing the fluidity between those two worlds. And then, I realized that I was not sure what type of stories that I wanted to make. And I also rebelled very much from my upbringing. I didn't want to become like my parents, Garcia Marquez has this line that he says, you're getting old when you start seeing your father in the mirror. So, but then I realized that through the science and through the biology and then doing research at Rockefeller, I realized that I had stories that I wanted to tell. And I was just really interested in the microscope and the tools. And I soon realized that I was more interested in kind of the doing the science and also the aesthetics and telling stories around it than actually doing research and producing results. And so that's how I kind of went into film. And then I ended up going to NYU Film School, which is where my mom had gone to. And so, as much as I tried to rebel from my upbringing, I ultimately kind of followed her footsteps. And I have a lot of science stories that I want to tell, but of course I have other stories that I make as well. And I don't necessarily consider my films to be science films. I always find it strange to label films as, a science film, or it happens a lot with science because science film is often associated to documentary or to science fiction. It doesn't happen in other fields. You may call a humanitarian film, or maybe you can also refer to an art film, a film that maybe is not in the mainstream. But I always find it curious that people say, oh, you make science films, but ultimately that's what I've been gravitating towards, is making stories around scientists, and also very interested in fictionalizing the lives of animals and using science as a metaphor. So that's a little bit kind of my background. I also was trying to avoid the real world for many years. So I spent a lot of time studying and doing research, and then film school was an amazing kind of petri dish to learn how to make films and kind of put to the test a lot of the ideas that I was playing around with almost as a hobby when I was a scientist. And then when I went to film school, the hobby became a reality, and I started making films and realizing that this is what I wanted to do. So that's a little bit of Yeah.
Was it an easy transition going to film school, and what your scientific background, what advantage or what vantage point you had with that background going to a film school?
It wasn't easy, but I think Rockefeller University, just to a shout out to Rockefeller, was also very much like a liberal arts science education. They had this association with the MoMA, the Rockefeller Foundation, so we had access to the MoMA. We were just talking earlier about I worked with a postdoc called Pablo Meyer, a French-Mexican scientist who was also interested in cinema. So I was surrounded by people that were kind of in the arts and science. They had these Friday concerts at Rockefeller. We could go listen to these musicians. The campus was surrounded by Chuck Close paintings and all kinds of things that were lent from the MoMA. But the transition, of course, is hard because when you're in the scientific world, you're meant to think sometimes that this is like a one-track, that you do a PhD, then postdoc, and then you try to become an assistant professor. So in many ways, I had to, convince myself to begin with that that becoming a filmmaker and going into the arts was a viable, path. And of course, I had to convince my advisor. And when you do a PhD, your advisor, what we call the PI, has a lot of power over your career. And I was lucky enough to have a PI that, he would see me once in a while with a camera in the lab, and he would be like, "Oh, that's great. Maybe we can present your films in the next meeting." So he was very supportive. His name is Dr. Herman Steller. And so, but there was a lot of convincing. And as you mentioned, I created this foundation, the Imagine Science Film Festival, as I was in my PhD. So the creation of that and already creating a network in science and film gave me the courage also to then go into film and study film. So I almost created like a mini nest where I could then say like, okay, well, I'm meeting people that are also in this world, and it allowed me. But when I graduated from my PhD, I was already in my first year of film school. I had to go back to Rockefeller to graduate. And I remember that it took a lot of convincing to academics and to scientists. And, the lab that I first worked in, Michael Young with Pablo Meyer, ended up getting the Nobel Prize just a few years ago for their work on sleep. Basically, they work on sleep-wake cycles, but and the biological clock. But anyway, so that's what happened. And I thought that film school would be a good way for me to enter into the film world, because I had apart from my mom and a few acquaintances, I thought film school would be a great way for me to meet people, and whether it was other students or professors. And that's what happened. I was able to, have professors like Spike Lee that supported me, and other professors, and all the students that were in the program helped me make films and my early films. And I learned a lot also by helping others. So.
What was the impetus of creating that Imagine Science Film Festival? There was no other outlets. What was the context in terms of creating that film festival? And also, up until now, I mean, have you seen more of those type of festivals? Has there an increasing interest on both sides? Or?
Yeah, I would say that in the mid, not to reveal my age, but in the mid 2000, like 2005, 2006, there was already kind of an interest in science communication. This was becoming much, I mean, it's always been around, but I think there were a number of organizations, especially in New York. There was the World Science Festival started at the same time as Imagine Science, which is a festival that celebrates science and arts. But the reason I started it is because I felt that there was this kind of gray zone of science and fiction, and also experimental ways of approaching science. And I always refer also to Imagine Science as having a bit of an avant-garde streak, and maybe because I'm also French, I'm influenced by French cinema, and I feel like a lot of early films are all science films, like Alphaville from Godard, or Je t'aime, or Mon oncle d'Amérique from Alain René. All these films are just like, films that I would gravitate, or I would define as scientific. And so I felt that there was a need for because I realized that also PhD students and science students, they all had interest in film and music, and I felt that there was a need to create this kind of organization that celebrated, not only straightforward science documentaries that you would find on Nat Geo and Discovery Channel, but kind of more of this like experimental club. I almost call it like a club, underground, where people would meet, like a Dead Poet Society, where people would meet and scientists and artists would meet. And it was sort of my life as well. When I was a PhD student, most of my friends were musicians and artists. And so there was also a selfish reason. I was like, I needed to create an organization to bring together all of the people that I wanted to bring together. And so that's why I created it. And also to communicate real research, research that's happening today, and to show that scientists are creative minds as well. So that was the impetus, that was the reason. But I had no experience in creating a festival. A lot of people discouraged me, but and I didn't have any venues. Of course, you're in the middle of New York City, to get a venue in New York. And so I collaborated with universities, and many places shut the door on me and said, like, because I proposed the idea of a festival without any films, without any kind of knowledge. And A Small Story is actually the first films that I showed were films that were supported by the Sloan Foundation, because the Sloan Foundation was already giving out awards to Sloan films, and we had that slate of films that were given from Tribeca and Sundance and all these places, and from film schools. And so that provided, let's show some films from the Sloan Foundation, and that gave me also kind of the, it gave me kind of like the justification of this exists. There are foundations like Sloan Foundation that does this, and many years later, it's amazing to think that I received the Sloan Prize, and it's just a kind of an amazing full circle in that regard. So
for those like me, that we're not well versed in the scientific world, you already mentioned that you're not, kind of separating with that scientific films. But what's kind of a sort of a, without getting too philosophical or too specific, what's kind of the definition of a science in the film festival? What kind of films, and what does it constitute a film on science? For practical matters.
Yeah, so when we organize the festival, we often have these discussions like after films, and scientists sometimes come to me and say like, oh, that wasn't a science film, why did you include that in your program? And I'd say no, it was, and I always thought that I wanted to create like a bit of a manifesto, like Dogma 95 would be like, hey, this is like the ingredients of a science film. In my opinion, what makes a science film is making sure that the scientists are integral to the making of the film, not only acting as advisors, but also featured in the film. Their data is inside the film, whether or not they do microscope work or, it's very important to have that content inside the film and not necessarily have to recreate it. I mean, you can recreate it or reenact it, but having that in the film. The other thing that I would consider to be a science film is to also celebrate the process of doing science, like almost like playing an instrument, sitting down, putting something on the vortex. It's like cooking. It's like watching like Top Chef, you put something in the cooker, and while you do that, you go get some coffee. Then you start a dissection at the microscope. You talk to your neighbor. You listen to NPR as you're dissecting like a fruit fly larva. It's such a surreal world, and it's such a beautiful world. And I think just the process of doing science is not seen often in film because there's a lot of emphasis on discovery. Let's focus on, and those films are great. Let's focus on like the life of Alan Turing in Imitation Game, or let's focus on, the beautiful minds and the Nobel laureates. But I think just the regular scientists doing science, of course, you have to find ways to dramatize that to make it exciting for the audience, but I think it's important to show that. And so those are the types of things. And of course, science is also intimately involved with life and other life, whether it's animal life or plant life. And I think it's important to show that life because you're ultimately I'm very kind of biased to biology because that's my field, but you need to show, how a scientist studies life, because that's what makes it so interesting, is that they're in a laboratory setting and they're studying life. And how does that impact their own life and their personal life and their relationships and their depression or their happiness. I mean, all of this is connected, and so that's what I try to do. And of course, it's a lot to digest, but that's what it is. And of course, my big obsession is microscopes. I have like 20 microscopes at home, and I love filming through the microscope because I think it's just like an amazing texture to add to cinema that we don't see often.
I find that very interesting. Talk about microscopes and kind of opposition to the big screen. You're going to the opposite in perspectives. Do you see also connection in terms of those different kind of perspectives?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting experience to take something from the microscope and project it on a big screen. I think there's something really surreal, and it also comes back to early cinema. Like the very, very first films that were made. We can go back to like British naturalists like Percy Smith, and early cinema was also, a lot of it was filmed through microscopes. And Edward Murbridge was trying to understand anatomy and human locomotion and trying to understand how animals moved. And so this was the beginning of cinema. And I think there's something really beautiful about taking images. And also the other thing that I was going to mention is not necessarily having to explain what the image is. Just let it live as abstract and conceptual. So like if I show you like a very, very big chrysalis of a fruit fly, which, is how the film actually began, Son of Monarchs, you may not really know what it is, but there's something about it that that is very visceral, and I like showing science without explaining it, because I feel like oftentimes in film and TV and the web, everything is over-explained. There's always voiceover. There's always somebody telling you, this is, stem cells or this or that. And I just like, let's sit with the image. I remember that I really enjoyed the beginning of Tree of Life, Malick's film, because it was like 5 minutes of like this microscopic kind of like images that were shown to you without any necessarily context. And I thought that was, it was an interesting and bold move. And so that's what my interest is. And it also adds a layer of magical realism, but I'm not creating science fiction. I'm using real images and creating the sense of magical realism with existing footage, existing content. And you'd be surprised, all of these images that are taken under the microscope, many of them never see the day of light. They're like stocked in on computers in the back room of laboratories. And so I have like a big advocate to retrieve all of those images and treat them as cinema, treat scientific data as cinema.
Great. Let's talk about the film, about Son of Monarchs. You wrote the screenplay. What was your inspiration about writing that screenplay and telling that story of a Mexican biologist in New York going back to his country?
Yeah, so whenever I work on a film, it takes me 10 years to make every film. So it takes me a while. I'm trying to increase the frequency of making feature films, but I treat it a lot as doing research, because there's a lot of there's a lot of work that goes into interviewing scientists, and there's also like short films that I make before entering into the world of feature film, which comes with obviously financial and a lot of other things to worry about and to figure out. But oftentimes the idea of a film comes from I found, because again, this is me thinking about how I started the film, but a lot of it started with the animal, with the Monarch Butterfly, which I started seeing in many different contexts. I saw it in a political context, because the Monarch Butterfly was used as a symbol for migrant rights.
Can you just elaborate actually in the Monarch Butterflies, because I'm sure a lot of our audience are not familiar with that.
Yeah, so the Monarch Butterfly is as the name says, it's a very kind of regal, very royal insect that exists all around the world. There are many populations that are what we call sedentary. They don't migrate. But one of the longest migration of any insect, of any winged creature, is the monarch butterfly that basically is born in Canada and travels all across, born in the Toronto area, travels all across the US and arrives in Mexico every year, where it hibernates for a few months and then, wakes up and then goes back to Texas, and then eventually multiple generations later ends up back in Canada. And so this migration happens every year. The monarch butterfly is also a toxic butterfly, meaning that it doesn't have any predator. And that's why it's bright orange, is because it eats a plant called milkweed, and it makes it toxic. So no other animal can touch it. And that's why it migrates for so long, is that it's almost like X-Men, it's like invincible. And so recently, with everything that's been happening related to the border, and policies and discussions about undocumented workers and migrant rights, the butterfly has been used as a symbol saying, the butterfly doesn't have any borders. It crosses the borders every year. And so as the monarch butterfly, we are all monarch butterflies, basically. And so I started seeing it in different types of protests. People would, hold up like monarch butterflies. I also met an Argentinian activist in DC called Cesar Maxit, who draws like these monarch butterflies, but inside the images, there's like images of people migrating. There's kind of like hidden images. And so
there's also the great group, We're the Radical Monarchs, also doing great work in the grassroots level.
Exactly. So that fascinated me, and also I realized that it was an animal that didn't really have one nationality, right? It was Canadian, American, and Mexican, and also that it was also endangered, and it was endangered because of climate change and because of many policy and human-induced climate change and pesticides and Monsanto that is affecting a lot of the crops, deforestation in Mexico, just changes in climate. And so it just symbolized a lot. So I was interested in that aspect. And then the other aspect was that monarch butterflies butterflies were used in laboratories quite a lot in the recent years. And people were interested in studying color and patterns. And I thought, wow, what an amazing way to speak about race and color and gender. This idea that somebody studies like how butterflies create their colors can be a beautiful metaphor to in a subtle way talk about racial politics, or talk about like racial culture and these types of things. So I felt that the monarch butterfly was an amazing convergence of all of these different disciplines, and I started embarking on trips to Mexico and shooting short films, and then kind of started developing the script as I was doing kind of these ideas. And so then I came up with the idea of Son of Monarchs, which was, again, I wanted to tell a story about immigration that was not your typical story. And I wanted to tell a story of an immigrant scientist in New York that goes back to Mexico. So kind of this like countering some of the films which is always about crossing the border into the US, but more about somebody that wants to return home, and that lives in New York and is a scientist. And in many ways, it's a little bit my story, because I also left France and I lived a little bit in Venezuela as well. But it was a bit my story, where I ended up in New York as a scientist during my 20s.
So does the film has a lot of autobiographical elements?
It does, because I when you're in your early 20s, I was also trying to figure out, what I wanted to do with my life, and also these multiple identities that I had. I had my Latin American friends. I had my French group. I was living in New York. I was a scientist, but most of my friends were artists. I was very confused, and in a way, the laboratory was like my refuge. It was my safe place. So whenever I was, not feeling well, or I needed a moment to myself, or or issues with relationships, I would just go to the lab, and it was like a space of introspection. I remember sitting in the dark room with the fluorescent microscope, and just spending hours like imaging, insects. And so yeah, this is probably the most biographical or autobiographical film that I've made, in kind of my early film career at this point. So
for me, one of the most striking elements of your film, has very different elements, but one of them is the depiction. We rarely see, if ever, a Mexican darker-skinned biologist as the protagonist of a film. When we talk about Mexican culture in general, usually depicted in certain jobs and certain elements. So it's a very interesting provocation to have a Mexican biologist as the main protagonist of your story. Can you talk about it?
Yeah. So when I was doing my PhD, my lab, I spent time in different labs, but my lab was full of people from, it was like the United Nations in there. It was there was all these countries. There were there were Latin Americans, there were Europeans, and it was just amazing to me to see like all of these people were coming to study in these laboratories in New York and the US. And so that was something that struck me, that we don't see that diversity in the scientific community. We don't see that on screen very often. So so when I was trying to figure out who would play the role, I wanted to make sure that it was, it was somebody that people may have, that they wouldn't particularly expect this person to be a scientist. And the reason why I wanted that is because when I was a scientist, a lot of people would tell me, "Oh, Alexi, you don't strike me as a scientist." And I would be like, what does a scientist look like? What is a scientist supposed to say? And so I met Tenoch through friends, Tenoch Huerta, and when I spoke to him the first time, when I was living in Coyoacán in La Ciudad de Mexico, and I remember a friend of ours, a common friend, like called him and said, "Oh, you have to meet Alexi," and we met the next day. And I realized that Tenoch had all of this like interest in science. He was like, "Oh, I'm reading, a book about evolution," and so I was like, "This is it." I kind of realized that there was this interest in science and interest in understanding research, and he was also asking me questions about gene editing, and so that kind of was kind of like a love story with Tenoch in terms of like saying, he has so much interest in it, and it's definitely a role that is different, for him to some extent. And that's also, and I give him credit because, I'm a French filmmaker landing in Mexico, telling him about the story about a scientist. And I give him a lot of credit because, he was shooting Narcos, and to kind of jump into this experiment, I mean, literally experiment, and go on for the ride. And yeah, and thanks to Tenoch, we were also able to get many other actors involved. Again, because they were interested in the science angle, it was different for them. Yeah, I mean, I can talk hours about it, but Tenoch, of course, we trained him a little bit in the lab. We spent like a day or two working at the microscope, and we also did a lot of voiceover about science, and we had a lot of conversations about, latest scientific discoveries, and a lot of that ended up in the film. So.
And I mean, it's pretty amazing cast that you were able to ensemble. Just to name a few actors: Alexis Rasmussen, Lázaro Gabino Rodriguez, Noé Hernandez, Paulina Gaitán, William Mafotter, and Angelica Aragon. Very solid ensemble. But the same way you created this great cast, you also work with an amazing crew. How do you work with all this? How do you contact all these key elements, all these key people to work in your film?
Right. So just one small story about the other members of the cast is Lázaro. I met him through a friend of mine, cinematographer called Pedro, and Lázaro, he was going to play the friend that does rituals, in Mexico. And when I spoke to Lázaro, he said, "I'll play the friend, but I want to make sure that I also understand science. I'm up to date on the latest science." So he wanted to, there's a scene in the film where he says, "I spit in a tube to understand my ancestry, and I realized that I'm related to like Neanderthals." And so it's like this little joke, but that came from him. And he said, if I play, if we do this ritual in Mexico, I want to make sure that it's not disconnected from science, that ritual and science are connected to each other. So that also was really interesting to me, is that even though the film has science and spirituality, those two are actually very much connected to each other and connected to the character. Now, for the crew, you know how it is in the film world. It's all connections and friends and people that I had known. One of the first people that I got involved with was Jano Mejia, who's the cinematographer that I had known for 10 years, living in New York. He was one of the owners of Cantina Royale, this place in Williamsburg, this bar that I had gone to. And so he had known about the project for 10 years because I had the idea. He immediately was on board to be part of this experience. And then slowly we started building the cast. What was wonderful is that I had a team in Mexico, and I also had a team in New York. And both of them were kind of working together, but also working separately in terms of building the crew. And it was one of the most magical film setting experiences, because on the crew, it was all like, Latinx, all of the, like, Latin America was represented. We had Costa Rica, Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico. It was just like an amazing crew of, and I had sometimes felt bad for the American actors, like Alexia, that plays the girlfriend, Alexia Rasmussen, because, everybody else was like Latin American. It was just like an insane like representation of all the countries there. And so we also had like a Colombian AD and a Colombian production designer. And so I think that the way we also got the crew was because they were interested in telling these stories that were about different types of Latin American portrayals in cinema. I think they were interested in, we're gonna make a film about Latin American scientists and artists, because there's also a few scenes in there where some of the actors are also performing, and so that's how it happened. And it was and a lot of it was like key people like Jano and Maria, my producer, and Abraham in Mexico, them recommending people and then just kind of building on that.
You already talked a little bit about this, but for me, it's also like a very important and integral part of the film. Your film, along with other recent films. I'm thinking of the documentary film I'm Living Now, Ya Me Voy, by Armando Croda and Lindsay Cordero, or Fernando Frias is I'm No Longer Here, Ya No Soy Aquí. Those films, your film, challenged the traditional American narrative of the American dream that the future is in the US. Without spoiling too much the film, the ending of the film, you challenged that, and in those three films, the protagonist, or the future, is in rather south of the border, which for me is like a kind of a very political challenge to this idea of the American dream, and more so in 2021, when the political context in these countries are very difficult, particularly for migrants. So can you just elaborate a little more in terms of that ending, and if there's a direct link in terms of a political reading?
In terms of where it happens in Mexico, or in terms of
no, in terms of that ending of positioning the future in Mexico, not in the US anymore, for the character.
Yeah, so right. So I wanted to make the statement about the film, kind of, without saying too much about it. I wanted it to start in Mexico and kind of end in Mexico, and counter kind of this idea of a few things. One is the idea of the American dream, and also this idea that migration is something that is one directional as well. I wanted to kind of emphasize this idea that, we can move around as Monarch Butterflies frequently. We're not, my life is a little bit like that. I'm a bit nomadic. Right now I'm in Madrid. I teach in Abu Dhabi. I'm obviously right now with the pandemic, nobody can really travel. But so this idea that migration, of course, in some cases with people that are, in situations where, migration is permanent, because it's very hard for them to go back home. But I also wanted to, and I think it's important to understand that there's another type of migration that happens, especially with Latin Americans, where people move around. They move around, and there's this idea of also returning home at specific moments of your life, and so that was a very important thing for me, was this kind of cyclical nature, which is mentioned by Lázaro, that life is a cycle, and and without getting a little too much like new age or spiritual, I thought it was really important that we refer to migration as like a cycle, basically, and kind of mimicking the patterns of the monarch butterflies to that extent. So that was important for me, and of course, it was a lot of those decisions were made also in the editing, on how to start the film, how to end it, and what's interesting, without giving too much away, there's a lot of people that have asked me that have seen the film in various stages. They say, "Oh, did he return back to Mexico? Is he living there now?" And so I like the uncertainty of people not knowing where he actually ended up and whether or not he decided to go back permanently or not.
We're running out of time, but I have one last question just to also touch up once again in this term of hybridity, not just you as a French Venezuelan filmmaker living in New York, working in Europe, and but also in terms of the film itself. It's a U.S. Mexican co-production. You were talking about with an international crew, mostly Latin American. But what we've seen, I've always said that. I always say that co-productions, or at least co-productions with the U.S., is kind of the ultimate frontier for Latin American cinema, in the sense that this country, the U.S., doesn't have co-productions formally because there's no film institute and because there's no that figure. Even though there's more, I think we've seen in the past few years more interaction in that sense. But usually, it's like filmmakers raise the funds in one side of the border, either in Latin America, and then come shoot here, or vice versa. All the funds are raised here, and then they go to Mexico. In your case, I found also very interesting that you were able to successfully mix and do a true co-production between the U.S. and Mexico. So I'm really curious how you were able to manage that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was not easy. Not easy in terms of many aspects of organization and funding. I think we were able to get it. Oddly enough, we were able to make it a co-production, also thanks to the science, right? Because a lot of the co-production aspect was the cooperation of for example, La Biosfera in Michoacán. They were, a lot of the support that I got in Mexico was also there was also a lot of in-kind support, right? Giving us access to, Policía Federal to protect us in Michoacán and help us during the shoot, access to los santuarios, being able to film there. So there was a lot of that happening, but I think that a lot of the funding of the film and a lot of the co-production aspect happened through this kind of science outreach funding procedure that in some ways science funding is more international and lends itself more to co-production than film funds, because sometimes film funds are, especially in the US. I mean, I'm from France. I was also trying to get co-production money to shoot in Latin America, through the CNC, but, I wasn't fully able to achieve that. So I think that that's really ultimately how I made the film, was kind of enforcing the fact that this was a film that was about like science communication and science awareness, and I was able to kind of successfully do it. But it wasn't easy because the film is also in 2 languages. It's bilingual, and I want to kind of, as there's like a closing statement, say that we need more films that are in 2 languages or 2 or more languages. I think there's a tendency of always saying like, oh, I'm going to stick to one. And also the other thing is that even if the actors don't they make mistakes in one language, or there's a bit of this like rawness to the language, it's just so beautiful to see that on screen. And I think Tenoch his English is perfect, but his accent, the way he speaks, I feel like there's a need for kind of bilingualism in cinema. There's a need for that more than what we have now, I think. And so that's a little bit about the co-production kind of journey, but it was definitely tough, and we ended up shooting it without money for post-production. We had to raise more, and fortunately the Monarch Butterfly was attractive to get people excited about the film. So I want to thank the Monarch Butterfly for that. So.
You were mentioning that it takes you a while to develop projects. So I'm sure you already start working on new projects, film projects particularly. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'll be short because I know that we're running out of time. I'm in Madrid right now because I'm working on the adaptation of a very famous neuroscientist at the turn of the 20th century. His name was Santiago Ramón y Cajal. He was the father of neuroscience, but he was also part of the movement of the invention of color photography because a lot of his work was about staining, and so he was interested in color. And he was also a science fiction writer, and he wrote this beautiful story about a man that wakes up one day and he sees the world magnified, and he sees bacteria, and it's called El Pesimista Corregido, the corrected pessimist. And so I'm going to make a film where I incorporate his science fiction with his life, and also his dreams will be kind of the future of neuroscience today. He's going to imagine neuroscience in modern times. So the film is called El Beso because it's based on the name that he gave when two neurons connect to each other, which is called synapses. The name that Cajal wanted to give it was called El Beso. So that's the name of the film. And I'm also working on another film about my childhood, which is also, a lot of my work is I'm very interested in docufiction, incorporating documentary and fiction. So we'll see what happens. Right now I'm in Madrid for 4 months. I just went to Cajal's home that's near El Parque El Retiro, and just taking it in and imagining. It's easy to imagine Madrid in the turn of the century because of the pandemic. There's a lot of empty streets, so it makes it easier to imagine it in the 1900s. So that's what I'm working on, and also going to approach some actors here, potentially Javier Camara and other actors that I'm very interested in working with. And so yeah, keeping busy and also teaching at NYU in Abu Dhabi. So
a great pleasure, Alexis, talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carlos. And thank you.
Good luck with the premiere at Sundance. I'm sure the film will have a very good reception. Yeah,
thank you to Cinema Tropicana for everything that you do, and it's just it's such an important organization for for the work that we do, and I'm just like amazed. I don't know how you sleep. There's just so much work that happens, and of course I want to thank the Sundance Film Festival and being part of the next program, and of course Isabel, the Roxie Theater in Fort Mason for having, and of course the Sloan Foundation for this amazing award. So thank you everybody, and enjoy the film, and reach out if you have any questions about Monarch Butterflies. I'm here to address them.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias.